Good afternoon, everybody. Can anyone hear me? Great. Welcome to Human Security Lab's virtual roundtable on a peacekeeping mission for Afghanistan ? I'm Charlie Carpenter. I direct Human Security Lab, and I'm very grateful to the School of Behavioral and Social Sciences here at UMass for supporting our working group. Also to the tireless research assistants at the lab and the comms team at SBS for their hard work in the lead up to this event. And of course, the esteemed experts who agreed to join this webinar on very, very short notice at the busiest time of the teaching year. And thank you to all of you as well in the audience for joining this conversation about how to manage the conflict in Afghanistan. Despite President Biden's optimistic words this week that conflict is certainly not over, not at least for the Afghans or for the Taliban or for the Tajik resistance in the Panjshir Valley, not for the former Afghan government, not for neighboring countries facing floods of refugees, and not for the many conflict actors now engaged in that region. So we're here to think today about whether UN peacekeeping has solutions to offer better than those offered by the US occupation, or by leaving Afghanistan to itself. And this is really a basket of questions. So among them, what is peacekeeping? Our panelists will speak more to that, but let me just introduce this roundtable by saying what peacekeeping is not. Peacekeeping is not counterinsurgency. We're not here to discuss a return to what was in Afghanistan before the US pulled out. Counterinsurgents side with a government against rebels. They use compellant force to achieve their aims. Peacekeepers assist in promoting, brokering, and enforcing solutions between conflict actors, and the best ones do so in dialogue with ordinary people in conflict-affected areas. They observe and witness what's going on. They mediate conflicts. They use persuasion and inducement and mostly non-military means to change behavior. And if they do engage in conflict, if they engage conflict actors militarily, it's only to protect themselves, civilians, or civilian aid organizations. So a UN peacekeeping mission would not be another counterterrorism mission. It would be a mission of international custodians of peace. So this is a bit in theory, right? But this is a different approach, not yet tried in Afghanistan. It's also different from what the UN is currently doing there under extraordinarily difficult conditions, delivering humanitarian aid, but without protection for humanitarian corridors, conducting diplomacy without security guarantees to assist the actors in making credible commitments to peace. And in the next 10 days, as many of you may know, the UN Security Council will meet to consider whether to renew and how to strengthen that tiny UN mission in Afghanistan. And Human Security Lab's working group on Afghanistan is considering whether peacekeeping is a tool set that should be on the table. So this conversation is part of that. Why might peacekeeping help? Our panelists will talk about that. And based on media reports of peacekeeping failures in some places, historically, you may have your doubts. But the thing is, you don't hear much about the many places where peacekeeping works. As Georgetown professor Lise Howard wrote in an LA Times op-ed this week, it has historically been one of the global community's most effective and underappreciated tools. And the reasons for that are when neutral witnesses are present with the consent of conflict actors, those actors are statistically likeliest to behave better. When conflict actors and civilians believe a party is neutral, they are statistically likelier to seek nonviolent forms of conflict resolution with that third party as a broker. And in places where peacekeepers have mandates to protect civilians, it's the perception that they're on the side of the civilians rather than either warring party that reduces violence. And even in the most complex, difficult situations like Mali, South Sudan, or the DRC, where it's impossible to prevent all violence by jihadists or the state, research shows peacekeepers can still tamp down violence, also among civilians themselves, and engage in conflict resolution and reduce animosities and save lives. So those are some of the reasons to think about this option. With that said, peacekeeping is not without its perils and disadvantages, as George Washington University's Professor Paul Williams reminded us this week in the Global Observatory. It's a complicated endeavor to stand up a mission, as you'll learn on this panel, and it's an even more complicated endeavor to make one work. How do you broker a peace you can keep? How do you get the warring parties to agree to peacekeepers? How do you convince the Security Council to authorize and fund such a mission? And how do you get troop contributing countries to send their soldiers into harm's way? How do you structure a mission so it's culturally appropriate, maximally effective, while minimizing the chances it can make things worse? These are really important questions, but they're not in and of themselves reasons to doubt that peacekeeping could work, because it has in many complicated contexts. But these are reasons to think carefully and begin thinking now about how it could work and what it would need to work if it could work in Afghanistan. And that's a question that perhaps should have been asked as long ago as 2002. Well, we're here today. So let me introduce our panelists, who will each make very short opening presentations about some different dimensions of what peacekeeping is and how it works, whether, why, and how to think about standing up the UN peace operation in Afghanistan. And after these presentations, we want to hear your ideas and respond to your questions. I'm going to alternate between calling on audience members who raise a hand and wish to speak in person, if we end up having that functionality. I believe we may, and pulling questions from the Q&A, where you can type your queries as we go along, anonymously if you wish, and where you can also upvote others' questions. So please keep an eye on that Q&A as we speak. Thumbs up the questions you most want answered, and we'll keep going until about 3:30. And just in the interest of time, I'll just ask that no more than 2 panelists tackle any one question to make sure we have time for many audience members to participate. Our distinguished panelists here are all experts in different dimensions of peacekeeping, civil wars, or international conflict resolution. Dr. Sabrina Karim is Associate Professor at Cornell University and Director of the Gender and Security Sector Lab at Cornell. She's also author of the award-winning book, Equal Opportunity Peacekeeping, Women, Peace, and Security in Post-Conflict Countries. Dr. Chiara Rufa is Associate Professor in War Studies at the Swedish Defense University and Academy Fellow at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University in Sweden. She's the author of Military Cultures in Peace and Stability Operations, Afghanistan and Lebanon. Professor Lisa Holtman is Deputy Head of Department of Peace and Conflict Research, also at Uppsala. She heads projects on ending atrocities and the politics of protection, and she's spearheaded some of the most ambitious quantitative studies on the effectiveness of peacekeeping through the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. Dr. Holtman is also the author of Peacekeeping in the Midst of War. Dr. Faten Goshen holds the Melody S. Robideau Foundation Fund Professorship and is a distinguished professor at University of Arizona's School of Government and Public Policy, and an affiliate in the School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies at University of Arizona. She's an expert in international conflict management, especially in Islamist contexts, and the author of literally dozens of articles on negotiation, bargaining, and international conflict resolution. Dr. John Ciorciari is Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy, University of Michigan, and Director of the International Policy Center and Weiser Diplomacy Center. He is an expert on international relations of the Indo-Pacific and author of Sovereignty Sharing in Fragile States. Dr. Ciorciari has previously worked in the Department of Treasury Office of International Affairs. And finally, Professor Christine Chang is a senior lecturer in war studies at King's College London. She teaches in the master's program on conflict security and development there. She is an expert on the political economy of post-conflict countries and the author of many books, including Corruption and Post-Conflict Peacebuilding, and a recent report entitled Securing and Sustaining Elite Bargains That Reduce Violent Conflict. Dr. Chang has previously worked for the United Nations and the World Bank and currently sits on the Governing Council of the Conflict Research Society. So thanks to you all for coming. We're all looking forward to very rich conversations. Professor Ciorciari, I know you have to run to teach at 2:30, so I will let you begin. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Charlie, and thanks for everyone for joining today for this really important topic and initiative. I want to start by offering a few comments on one important threshold question, which is the conditions for consent to any form of peace operation even if it's a very light observer mission in Afghanistan. I want to focus particularly on Taliban consent, although, as Charlie mentioned, the consent of other parties would also be important. Right now, Taliban consent is probably a function of international leverage and the Taliban's own sense of vulnerability. Remember that the Taliban are now switching from offense to defense. They're very thinly spread with lots of current or potential adversaries. They think that they're winning in the Panjshir Valley against the last major resistance group, which would not be auspicious conditions for consent, but they face lots of other problems. Already yesterday, Hazara militias attacking Taliban positions, the crisis at Spin Boldak on the Pakistani border where people are trying to flee the country. We can expect to see more of this, and also to see foreign support for various rebel groups in the country that will make it much more difficult for the Taliban to govern and to control territory in this new environment than it was for them to gain their current position in recent weeks. They're going to be trying to govern a state that's notoriously difficult to govern, and they have very little experience governing. Finances in the economy are in free fall. There's a humanitarian crisis looming, not least with respect to a food crisis. And so the Taliban is in a position of craving recognition. It needs humanitarian aid, particularly aid it can claim credit for with its population, and doubtlessly wants to avoid stiffer international sanctions and foreign support for rebel forces. All of this means international actors have several points of leverage. The question's whether key international players will prioritize a peace operation and be willing to work enough in concert with one another to elicit consent. Western governments at the moment appear focused largely on countering ISIS and al-Qaeda, and say that they're also committed to further evacuations, although some of the recent statements on that front have been tepid. Western governments don't appear at the moment to be as focused as they could or should be on protection of ordinary Afghan civilians, or even the prevention of escalating civil conflict. Pakistan, Iran, China, and others may have a more direct stake in stability of that sort, given the prospect of large refugee flows to their territory and spillover insecurity. But there's an obvious point of convergence to stress here, that humanitarian strife and civil conflict will make the ISIS, al-Qaeda, evacuation and refugee problems all intractable. And so this ought to be an area in which there's some sufficient overlap of interests in order to be able to generate a serious conversation, if not mobilize the full political will needed. Then we come to what the Taliban might be willing to accept. Obviously, the scope, size, and duration of the mandate will matter. I'm sure some of my colleagues will talk about the very unlikely event of a robust civilian protection mandate out of the gates. Presumably, the Taliban will also resist a mission that has a prominent focus on issues such as women's rights. Many key regional actors probably won't press on that point. Peace observers, though, can still, even if they aren't invested with a mandate that many of us would like to see, they can still call out abuses against women. And in any event, we shouldn't count on them to be the primary enforcers of certain aspects of human rights or delivers of humanitarian services. Think of their role more as a mechanism for the international community to hold the Taliban and its main foes at least partially accountable, and thereby diminish conflict in the way that Charlie foreshadowed. This makes more room for other UN agencies and NGOs to remain or to return to the country and to champion causes such as women's rights and meet humanitarian needs. So the takeaway, in my view, would be the need for an advocacy campaign, particularly in Western capitals, to broaden the discussion beyond terrorism and an exit corridor, and therefore to kickstart a serious diplomatic conversation about options for peace, a mission of some form. Thank you very much, Charlie.
Charlie, you're muted.
Thank you. Apologies. Thank you, Professor Chorchiari. I was suggesting we turn to Professor Karim next, just as John suggested that the public needs to get involved in thinking differently about this issue. What's on many people's minds in this country and elsewhere is the situation of women in Afghanistan in particular. Professor Karim, I know you have some thoughts on how a peacekeeping mission could support the protection of women as well as the protection of stability and peace in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Charlie, for convening this important discussion and bringing together such a great group of people to have this really important discussion. As you said, it's really important to understand all the different options on the table before throwing one out the door necessarily, or not even discussing it. And I do think that while this discussion is important for Afghanistan and the future of Afghanistan, it's also an important discussion to have about the future of peacekeeping in of itself as well. So thank you for convening us. I want to start out with just talking about some of the tensions and challenges with this idea that a peacekeeping mission could help protect women's rights in Afghanistan. And I do want to start out by saying that we should just be a little bit cautious about any kind of intervention being tied to promoting women's rights, just because the history of that, as we know, is really complicated with the US invasion in Afghanistan and in Iraq kind of being justified post hoc because of women's rights.
It looks like we may have lost Professor Karim momentarily. But if she does not reappear, what we'll do is move on to someone else and come back to her in the interest of time. Very noteworthy point that she's making, which is that any kind of intervention would need to be culturally appropriate, and that there's no magic bullets when it comes to protecting women's rights in a conflict zone. While we wait for her tech to come back, why don't I suggest that we move on to Professor Haltman with a few comments about the effectiveness of peacekeeping in general.
Thank you very much. As one of the Q&A points just raised, that we should maybe engage more Afghan scholars and experts, and I definitely welcome sort of any such feedback to this panel, which I think is an important point. What I wanted to talk about was protection of civilians. So asking the question, is peacekeeping with the protection of civilians mandate an option for Afghanistan? And what would that look like? And the short answer is, and I'm willing to be convinced that I'm wrong, but I think it's possible if it's done differently than we have done it before, but it would be politically uncomfortable for the West. So normally, so-called sort of POC missions, protection of civilians, are effective in protecting civilians in civil war contexts. This does not mean that they eliminate violence completely, but they do contribute to reducing violence. And POC mandates authorize the use of force to protect civilians from physical violence. These missions need to be large, with a sufficient number of troops and police to be present where civilians are at risk. If done in Afghanistan, I think we would have to rethink the way that we do protection of civilians. So I have sort of 3 points to raise. First, it would be impossible with a UN operation with a robust mandate, I think. That would only risk sort of turning into a continuation of the war that we've seen in the past 20 years. At the same time, it would have to be a large force to cover sort of the grounds and be present where civilians are at risk, but with a defensive posture, and only authorized, I think, authorized to use force in self-defense. So that would be different from previous mandates. But if we look at other POC missions, it varies a lot in how much peacekeepers actually use force. And if we look at research, it seems like the main effect from peacekeeping really comes from their presence in the country. So in observing, in reporting, and sort of dampening dynamics of violence, and doing other tasks that are not sort of using force. So the robust mandate is not only impossible in my view, but it might not be necessary. Secondly, it would have to be a narrow mandate, limited to bringing security. And it will be, I'm very interested to hear more about what Sabrina Karim has to say, but I think the goal to protect civilians cannot be undermined by sort of an ambitious political agenda that we usually see in peacekeeping mandates. I think that would backfire and generate more resistance to the UN presence. So the envisioned end goal of the mission must be a very modest one, focusing on security. And really, if the intended goal is to save civilian lives, the best approach is likely then a more sort of, I would call it more traditional peacekeeping, so without a robust mandate and with few mandated tasks. The third point I just want to raise is that we would have to accept a UN peace operation on the Taliban's terms. And I know there are a lot of other actors involved, but I'm going to assume that they are the main actor to negotiate with. So for a peace operation to be possible ever, the Taliban would have to give their consent. And I think they can be persuaded to accept the presence of the UN. They've signaled that they seek international recognition, and we could use sort of diplomatic pressure to get consent. But that consent would likely be conditional. As we've seen in other cases with repressive governments, the Taliban may limit peacekeepers' access to certain territories or areas, maybe where the Taliban themselves are threatening civilians. So the end result would be like a politically uncomfortable situation. But I don't think that there is a politically feasible solution to Afghanistan that is politically comfortable for the West. So I think we have to sort of avoid those kind of knee-jerk reactions to punish the Taliban with sanctions and military threats, but that would only make this situation worse for the civilian population. So instead of punishments, we should use foreign aid as a positive incentive, as we heard before, to negotiate the terms of a peace operation through the UN. And I think if we're truly concerned about the Afghan population, that's probably the best we can do, however dissatisfying it may be in the end. Thank you.
Professor Holtman. And I'm pleased to see that people are already starting to put questions and comments into the Q&A. Please feel free to go ahead and do that as we move along here, and we'll start getting to some of those when the presentations are over. So Professor Karim, glad to have you back with us. We'll just loop back to your comments on gender and cultural appropriateness and this dialectic you were alluding to before.
Yes, so sorry. That's the first time since we moved to Zoom that's ever happened to me. So I apologize. I think I got cut off when I was kind of listing some of the negative, things that have been happening to women as since the Taliban have taken over. So there have been reports of women not being able to leave their home, women who worked with the U.S. and others and other allies are being targeted, severe restrictions. There's this question mark about schooling and work. The Taliban have said that they won't put women in prominent leadership positions. And obviously a lot of women are scared. And so I think these are very real concerns. But what is interesting is that, right, as we know, women are not a monolithic group in Afghanistan. And so it's a lot of the time what we're hearing are from women who have access to Twitter, who can vocalize what's happening, and a lot of these women are in urban areas, etc. And what this shows is that there's actually a potential clash between the pillars of the women, peace, and security agenda. So just a quick outline, the three main pillars are prevention, participation, and protection. And so while the participation of women and the protection of women are definitely under severe threat as a result of the Taliban takeover, there is a bit of a question mark about whether those two pillars are in tension with the prevention pillar. And this is because a number of rural women in particular in Afghanistan are actually, we're most concerned not about their participation or protection, because a lot of them didn't necessarily even benefit over the last 20 years, but rather they just wanted to see an end to the conflict, right? An end to the violence. And so that prevention, they were willing to maybe accept Taliban rule because it ended the conflict. And we know that actually, the transfer was relatively peaceful in how it happened. And so there is a real tension between the prevention pillar and the participation and protection pillar. And it's important for any peacekeeping mission to understand this tension in how it develops any kind of mandate with regards to women, if that's going to be something that's on the table. But that's not to say that it can't do that, right? So the question is whether or not a peacekeeping mission can address this tension between among the three pillars. And I think, this brings us back to something Lisa was talking about, which is it's this idea of what do we mean by civilian protection? If there's a real threat to a return to violence, then obviously that prevention pillar is going to be threatened. And so if there are real threats from the north, if there are real threats from ISIS, that is going to, again, put women in this vulnerable position where they aren't necessarily, the conflict isn't prevented. The way to potentially target the participation and protection aspects of the three pillars for women, peace, and security is through international pressure, potentially making international recognition conditional on certain aspects of women's rights. Unfortunately, this becomes a little bit more difficult because women were left out of the Doha Agreement completely. So there's, if there was a monitoring mission, there's nothing necessarily on paper from that settlement to monitor with regards to women's rights, unfortunately, but that's something that could be negotiated in the future. One potential issue, I think, also is there's this question mark about whether or not the Taliban, and I think John was alluding to this, would be amenable to international pressure. Like, are the Taliban, can they be pushed to move one way or the other? And while we've talked about the fact that they want international recognition, one thought that I had was that, out of all of the jihadi groups and terrorist groups that, have been very happy about the Taliban winning against the West, the one group that hasn't is ISIS. And so there is a real tension between the Taliban and ISIS. And is it possible that if the Taliban do move more towards the West and more move towards international pressure, that could exacerbate the conflict potentially if ISIS presents the Taliban as, a part of the West? So that's also another thing to consider for any kind of international involvement, especially with peacekeeping missions. The last point that I just want to say is if there is a peacekeeping mission that we've talked a lot about whether that's a possibility, but if there were, I think it would have to be designed in a particular way. I think the place to start is with the political mission that's up for renewal, UNAMA, where there is a clear mandate for gender equality, human rights, and civilian protection already built into that political mission. I think it would be important to have some kind of fact-finding mission that tries to understand whether or not that could be expanded to an observer mission or any other kind of mission. And then finally, any kind of peacekeeping mission that would be deployed would have to be, I think, predominantly Muslim, and especially if there's going to be female peacekeepers, they would have to come from Muslim countries. That's okay. There's lots of countries that have women who deploy to peacekeeping missions. So I think there would be troop and police contributing countries that could provide female peacekeepers. The question is whether or not gender equality becomes explicit in the mandate or if it's more gender mainstreamed via other mandates. And then very, very importantly, any peacekeeping mission cannot have this problem of sexual exploitation and abuse. Because if there's one thing that's going to give the Taliban kind of leeway to be able to kick anyone out, it's going to be any violation of harming local women. And so sexual exploitation and abuse is particularly important. The zero tolerance policy is particularly important in a mission like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. I'd like to move on now to Professor Chiara Rupa.
Thank you very much, Charlie, for creating the space to have this really important discussion. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you. Like many of us here, I think that a UN mission in Afghanistan is highly desirable. To make it viable, however, we need to think in detail about how it could look like. And let me make 4 observations here about that. First, any UN peace mission to Afghanistan should be as far as possible from the ISAF stabilization operation led by NATO between 2003 and 2014. But there are a number of lessons, I think, that we can learn from ISAF's mistakes. For instance, during the NATO mission, troops parts of ISAF have systematically used humanitarian aid to achieve military objectives and win hearts and minds. Blurring the lines between humanitarian and military aims is dangerous. Also, the legacy of the ISAF mission means that all Western states that were involved in ISAF or Enduring Freedom should stay away from any involvement on the ground, particularly those that were involved in clear hold build operations. This leads me to my second point. I think perhaps a bit unlike Professor Karim, that we also need to distinguish a peace mission from the UNAMA Department of Political Affairs mission. Unlike what others perhaps have argued also in commentaries, UNAMA has done tremendous and really important work, but it may be perceived by some parties as not so neutral, since it has supported a political process that went in a different direction. So what we need right now, I think, is a brand new Department of Peace Operation mission. UNAMA should still be there, however, and continue to hold its position as the UN country coordinator for all UN agencies. And so here comes my third point. What kind of peacekeeping mission are we talking about? As already mentioned, the Taliban will never agree to a robust, large, multidimensional peacekeeping mission. So that is out of the question. But to gain some form of international legitimacy, they could agree to a much more limited peacekeeping mission. So here I think there are two options with some plugins. The first is a military observer mission along the lines of what Liz Howard has been suggesting. And the second is a larger peacekeeping mission, a bit more of a traditional peacekeeping mission, a bit along the lines of what Lisa Hullman is talking about, with lightly armed peacekeepers deployed on lightly armored vehicles. Plugins to either, I think, could be information gathering tools, for instance, using UAVs to ensure greater presence, as also Paul Williams has suggested recently. And this is being used, but so far only in robust missions. And my second and third plugins are slightly more creative, so perhaps a bit less realistic. So one would be a stronger than ever UN Army kind of approach, abandoning the troop country contributors uniform and embracing the idea of this signaling the presence of the United Nations Army on the ground. And my third plugins idea is about providing adequate force protection devices that could be provided by Western nations. These 3 points lead me to my fourth point. Who should be part of this mission? We have two clear research findings emerging from our research with Bove and Ruggieri to make a UN peacekeeping mission both viable and effective. First of all, diversity of troop contributing countries is a powerful tool to show the commitment of all nations united via the UN, to show their commitment and encouraging a peaceful resolution of the conflict. We find signaling of the commitment of the United Nations diversity and of the United Nations willingness as a whole very important on the ground. We also find that geographical proximity of troop contributing countries to the local population tends to increase violence, but cultural proximity of language and religion, for instance, reduces it. So what does it mean for a UN mission in Afghanistan? So this would mean designing a mission that is as diverse as possible, with a combination of Muslim country contributing from Asia, for instance, like Indonesia, or other parts of the world, like Egypt and Jordan, but also countries perhaps like Brazil, to increase the general diversity. Many have been talking about a leading role of China. While a contribution from China would be very important, our research would tend to suggest that this is culturally too far and too geographically proximate, so that our research finding would suggest against that. But taken together at this point, any contributing country is more than welcome, and doing anything is still probably much better than doing nothing at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chiara. And now we'll move on to Dr. Christine Chang.
Thanks so much, everyone. I'm really honored and just really enjoying this conversation. And it's just lovely to see so many friends around the table and actually in the audience. So there are three things that I just want to think through today with you, and really thinking aloud, and just working through the thought process myself about how I want to come out on this issue. So the first one that I want to clarify, I think, is in whose interests would this mission be? And then the second one is thinking about what does a counterfactual look like if there is no mission? And then the third point is really around difficulty and that tension, that uncomfortability that Lisa was alluding to earlier. So the first one, and I want to make explicit because I think it's helpful, in whose interests. So I really think of this, the foremost interest as being the kind of regular, average Afghan civilian, right? And if we keep that person foremost in our thoughts, I think that's the right way to frame this morally for me. And part of that group of people, although I would put them really more in the elite, in the middle class, is those that we've interacted with, to whom Western countries have an obligation, a moral obligation. So I'm really thinking about it in those terms. And then I'm thinking about it as a Westerner, right? And I'm seeing the decline of the West to some extent, given the events of, say, the past 5 years, but really since Iraq. And thinking about the framing of what Western power looks like, not just American power or British power, but broadly, literally like Western power, and how this really reflects on our credibility, right? Leaving our allies behind. And anybody who would consider being an ally of ours and what they're looking at Afghanistan and what kind of conclusion they would be drawing, right? So, it's pretty much a shambles right now. The question is, what is left of there that we could sort of at least paper over? And I think doing nothing would be very, very bad. And I usually say that doesn't necessarily mean that we should do something, but I think weighing up the alternative, which takes us to the second question, what does that counterfactual look like if there's nobody there? And Charlie raised this at the beginning of this conversation, just the reduction in violence issues. So if we think about this very explicitly about the people that we care about, that civilian, those people to whom we have moral obligations, how would the Taliban govern if there was no PKO there, if there was no peacekeeping mission of any kind, no observer mission, nothing, right? Basically, if we literally did what was promised and just left and pulled out entirely, what would that look like? And I think the answer to me, from just being a distant observer of Afghanistan for a long period of time, is that it wouldn't look very good. And I think there would be a real chance of a different kind of civil war within the Taliban. And there would be the kinds of situations with different rebel groups that John was talking about earlier on. And there would be potentially a different kind of destabilization. It might not be the kind that we're looking at now, but I think it could end up looming up on our horizon yet again. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are responsible for it, but I think to some extent we would still be seen as responsible for it. And I think that's important, right? The perception of the kind of mess that is being left behind as a result of the way that the withdrawal has taken place leads to an enormous amount of instability that, whether we like it or not, will be seen as the responsibility of the West. So thinking about that counterfactual, right? And if there are witnesses there, I do think that the behavior of all actors change on the ground. And it changes, if you've seen any kind of mission on the ground, you can feel the dynamics of what happens when there are international people there. Everybody's behavior changes in all sorts of different ways, in good and bad. But absolutely, I would could not agree more with the idea that there would be a reduction in violence. The problem is you can't show the counterfactual and say, oh yes, actually there would have been 10,000 deaths there and now there are only 1,000, right? And that's the difficulty, because you will still have that 1,000 and you have to live with that 1,000. And you can't show somebody else, well, what would have happened? So this brings us, I think, into that third difficulty and uncomfortability. What do we do with all of this, and how does it sit? And I've been thinking about, why people just want nothing to do with this. They don't want a mission, and I think part of the reason is because nobody wants to engage with the Taliban directly. It's anathema to anybody who worked for the UN, because everything that the Taliban does and stands for is the antithesis of everything that the UN purports to stand for. And having to work alongside and cooperate and give money to and support a government whose values sit in complete opposition to everything that democracy, human rights, good governance, and all of the rest, makes it really difficult to swallow, and being explicit about that as well. So this idea that Lisa was talking about, it would have to be on the Taliban's terms. I think that's a real difficulty, and I think that's one that makes people deeply uncomfortable, which is the one that makes people say, no, automatically, no, I want nothing to do with this. But I think the practicalities around it are, well, what happens if you don't, right? And I feel like you have to, as others have said, we have to get over ourselves. And I think that requires a long, hard conversation within our populations. And it's particularly hard. And I'm thinking about, work that's being done on vilification. Sophie Hafizlah's work and talking about how do you walk people down when you've been labeling a particular group as terrorists for such a very long time. And then all of a sudden you are saying, no, actually, we're going to give money to them and support them and cooperate with them. That's a really hard thing to ask of your populations, to change that rhetoric so quickly. And so I would say, this is part of the big conversation that would need to take place in order for any kind of mission to succeed. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chang. And finally, Professor Faten Goshen.
Thank you. I'm trying to share my screen. Did that work? I can't see what you all see. Okay, so I just want to start off by thanking Charlie for this ongoing discussion about an important matter. I think for many of us, we are tired of just sitting on the sideline and having a repeat what's been happening for the last 20-some year. And I also want to thank everyone who has joined us. Now, I believe, as my colleagues have been saying, that a window of opportunity exists right now. I'm going to try to slideshow. Here we go. Exists right now for two main challenges that Taliban is facing. The first issue is legitimacy, recognition, and security. The Taliban has to maintain a delicate balance between its fighters and not being labeled as a pariah state by the international community. The most significant threat facing Taliban will be domestic, and it will not be primarily from the Northern Alliance or the Afghan Defense units. It's going to be from ISIS-K and other groups who espouse the Takfiri ideology. In fact, the core of ISIS are commanders who were expelled from Taliban because they were too sectarian and too brutal for Taliban's vision and governance style. So while ISIS-K is not strong enough now, it will be more than happy to welcome disgruntled Taliban fighters into its fold. Also, over the years, Taliban has been able to gain legitimacy. This is why it was able to rise back again by providing services as they co-opted government and INGO services. And that will all change if they are ostracized, which brings us to the second challenge, and that is economic dilemma, which my colleagues have already alluded to. But the fact is that Taliban currently, the budget, 75% of it is financed by foreign aid. Sanctions are still in place, and state financial resources are held abroad and have been frozen. In fact, 7 billion of the 9 billion of Afghan central government's money is held by the Federal Reserve of New York, and both the IMF and EU countries have halted their aid packages. So, what to keep in mind as we're moving forward? Who should be at the table? We keep talking about Taliban and former Afghan officials, but we need to expand that table. Northern Alliance, Hezb Islami, other local leaders and groups who are beginning to see rise. And so we do not want to make mistakes that we have done time and time again in negotiations by not inviting the most important or the largest parties and individuals to the table. Who should mediate and why? It can, in essence, in short, it cannot be the US or any Western country. It has to be a multilateral mediation effort, which can be maybe through an organization like the United Nations, or not, facilitated by states, for example, like Qatar and or Turkey, who are currently already been in discussions and working as mediators. So they can move forward, but maybe with a stronger mandate. And of course, as has been mentioned, countries in the region do have an incentive. And the reason is, we don't want to be back here several years later after 9/11 happens somewhere. A lot of the groups that are inside currently, a list, just a couple of who I'm mentioning here on this slide, are a concern for Pakistan, for China, for Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and for the region as a whole. What are the issues on the table? I would say everything's on the table, from transitional government to human rights, gender rights, socioeconomic. However, we need to be careful, as Professor Karim was saying, not to prioritize idealism over practicism. Unless we have locally relevant and culturally embedded solutions, the peace will not keep. And last but not least, who can guarantee the peace? There are a variety of mechanisms by which peacekeeping forces can be included, whether it is some regional, whether it is international. But I would say, I know there's been some comments about the UN and how it may be perceived. UN is not a new actor for Afghanistan. And so I would say it can provide a domestic cover for regional or Muslim states, and they may need that in order to enter. So right now their hesitation may be because of that. And so I would say there is an opportunity. So I just thought to limit these for now, and happy to take any and all questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Goshen, and all the panelists. And thank you to the audience. I'm seeing so many interesting questions in the Q&A. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start going through those questions. I'll alternate them with taking questions from the audience by hand. If you wish to raise your hand, we'll call on those of you that we're able to, that we have time for, and you can ask your question live. I want to start with the first question at the top of the comment box, the Q&A. I also want to encourage those in the audience to read down the list of Q&A questions, because some are being upvoted, but there's some really interesting questions down below. And if you scroll down, you might find more that you want to jump up to the top. But the very first question, I think, is a really important one, which has to do with the appropriate mandate for this mission and pros and cons in how you structure peacekeeping mission mandates. And the question asked by an anonymous commenter is that if force is not allowed to be used or is even limited, will there not be a danger of a repeat of Srebrenica, where you had peacekeepers with a very defensive-only mandate who were not prepared or equipped or permitted to protect civilians when that massacre occurred? How would you speak to that? Lisa, yeah.
Okay, sorry. This is such a hard question. I think, is there a danger of a new Srebrenica? In a way, yes. I think sort of, when I say that it has to be sort of a limited use of force, that's just for political feasibility. And it's this balancing act. Like if we, and thinking about what Christine Chang said about the counterfactual, if we do nothing, I think the situation is terrible. If we try to do too much, it's going to backfire and it's going to be equally bad. So trying to find something in between that doesn't solve the whole problem. And there might be massacres that the UN cannot stop. But we can also try to learn from that and not try to sort of create these safe zones that aren't safe and that cannot be protected. So thinking more about what can be done with that limited use of force.
Mm-hmm. And my understanding at Srebrenica is that part of the problem was specifically that the mission was oversold to civilians. So they were told they would be safe and they would be protected if they clustered in these areas. And essentially, because that wasn't really true, what it did is it was very helpful to the Bosnian Serbs in allowing them to sort of corral civilians and then go in to massacre them. So presumably part of the logic here is that if you can't get consent for a really robust mission, you might still be able to do an observer mission with a more limited mandate, but the trick is going to be very clear to civilians, to the conflict parties, and to other actors, humanitarian actors in the region, about what the peacekeepers are really there for. I see a couple of hands up in the audience. I want to begin with Lise Howard, who I see is there. Saula, are you able to turn on, to allow Lise to talk and turn on her camera, or can I do that?
I've promoted her to panelist.
Okay. Lisa, you're a panelist for a moment. Where I still can't see you though. Where are you? There you are. All right, did you have a question for the panel?
Hi, everyone. So lovely to see you today. Thanks very much for this discussion. I really appreciate it. I completely agree, Lisa, with your last comment that I think that the Rwanda and Srebrenica are looming very large in my mind right now. And what are the dangers of genocide? And I think at the end of the day, there is a greater chance of genocide without observers than with them. But that it will be important not to overpromise, just as you said. I have general questions about the makeup. So what role for China? In that piece, I'd suggested that China serve as a pen holder, and then that got edited to leading. China's never served as a pen holder on a UN peacekeeping mandate. And since China has a direct interest, just as the US and France and the UK, when they are directly interested in a peacekeeping mission, they serve as the pen holder. What do we think about shifting to China, asking China to serve in that type of role? I would be interested to hear what you think. And I'm going to leave it there because we have so many other questions. I don't want to monopolize. Thanks so much, everybody. Lovely to see you.
Thank you, Professor Howard, for that question and for your op-ed this week. I'll let the panel tackle that one. Chiara.
Thank you so much, Liz. So I think that China could be a really convincing pen holder. I think, though, that we need to be careful when designing the mission, not to allow China perhaps to take too much space because of the concerns that I mentioned earlier about the potential, the too close sort of geographical potential proximity, and this also needs to be squared with a very high, trying to maximize the diversity of the mission. But I think China would be a really very convincing pen holder. It has already shown already today and yesterday some clear signals of interest, and before towards the region. So I think that definitely something that's a really interesting idea, and I think it would be worth pushing it forward.
Right. And Christine, go ahead.
So I just wanted to differentiate between the kind of different roles that there are here that various states could take, not just China, but thinking about, who's force commander, who is the SRSG, and then who is the pen holder, right? And which countries are leading on this and how that's perceived. And I think the balance of those things is really actually quite important. So you can have a force, because I think initially people are thinking about China leading the mission as in they are bringing in all of their troops, and I think that's highly unlikely. But I think colloquially that's the way that things are being discussed, and I think it's quite important to differentiate the kinds of roles, so that when people are asking these things and saying, oh yes, China should take the lead, that they aren't confusing the kinds of roles that we're talking about within, say, shaping a UN mandate, versus being the political head of the mission versus actually leading the troops. And I think the balance of those things has to be very delicately brought. Otherwise, it just isn't going to fly. And I wanted to raise another point that one of our earlier conversations yesterday, about how that would be handled. And it was such an excellent point. Not supposed to mention the person whose name made it, but they were talking about the fact that it can't be perceived as China would not accept a lead role in this kind of way if it was seen as something that the US was giving it and sort of allowing it to do. It would have to come really from the UN. It would have to be a UN mission, and then it would need to come from the UN rather than, okay, fine, we'll let you do it from the US side, because there would be a huge loss of face. And it would probably also just not fly domestically for them. So, thinking about if we were to move in this direction, how do you maintain that kind of very delicate, diplomatic, softly kind of approach?
Yeah, I wanted to just jump on this a little bit as well, which is to say there are many countries on the Security Council aside from the great powers. And in some sense, although all of the P5 countries would need to support this idea in the sense of not vetoing it, and although all have some interest in stability in the region, there's an argument to be made that none of them are the ones that are actually going to be seen as most legitimate in really taking the lead in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan has always been a country that prided itself on resisting anything that appears to be great power imperialism. There is an interesting sort of dance, a way that you finesse developing a mission like this in really a multilateral way that would be seen as and would be different from what has happened in the past. And it is complicated because the US also probably wants to save face. Joe Biden seems committed to the idea that he's done the right thing, perhaps even in the right way. At the same time, there's a bit of a catastrophe here, and nobody else probably wants it to seem as if he's handing his mess off to them. So there is a diplomatic dance here, but I think that that does not need to come at the expense of foregoing actions that could assist Afghans in building their country, having stability, resolving conflicts that exist. And there are many middle power players on the Security Council who could have an opportunity to exercise a leadership role right now. One, for example, this is a random example, and there are many others, but Estonia. Estonia is a country, a little country in Europe, who is actually developing itself quite rapidly into one of the most tech-savvy members of the United Nations, and it is one of the non-permanent members on the Security Council right now. The peacekeeping, technology and peacekeeping was just a big item on the Security Council agenda under India's presidency just this past month. So there's a lot of interesting issue linkages and synergies here, and opportunities for many countries to get involved in taking leadership here in a formal sense. It doesn't have to be limited to the question of who's going to go first. And if there was some impetus, the question is just making sure that the permanent five are on board, and thinking about how are you going to put together a mission that is going to be effective and going to be seen as legitimate to the Afghan people. And I wanted to actually connect this question about China's role to the next question in the Q&A list, which is by Harun Miesi. Sir, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. He's asking about Pakistan. Oh, sorry. Actually, your question disappeared. There was a question about Pakistan. It wasn't hers. It was Mohammed's. Well, yeah, here it is. Sorry, Harun, yours got upvoted, and we'll ask it next. But I was going to ask about Mohammed's question, which was previously at the top. What do our panelists think about the role of Pakistan in terms of peacekeeping? Pakistan brings the Taliban on the table, so why not let regional states handle the situation rather than bringing in the UN? And I think this is a similar question, sort of what's the right role, what's the best role, the most politically efficacious role for these different players. One of the themes that has come out of our working group is that this is a really great open question, and I'm interested to hear what you have to say. Pakistan might be one of those most interested and most capable of brokering some kind of intra-Afghan peace, but it's not necessarily the player whose troops would be seen as neutral by a majority of Afghan citizens, especially non-Pashtun citizens. So there's a real question. You want to construct a peace mission that is seen as neutral, not seen as siding with one of the parties to the conflict. So which would be countries who would be best for that? We've talked in our working group about the possibility of a mission that was composed purely of Muslim majority troops, or Muslim troops, or troops from Muslim majority countries. And that is something the Taliban has actually signaled in the distant past that they would have been comfortable with and would not have attacked such a mission. But which countries those troops should come from, I think it's a really interesting open question. So I'll just sort of bridge this China question to Mohammed Mansour's Pakistan question and kick it back to the panel. Fatim.
I think one thing to keep in mind, and I've seen it being raised even here in some of the questions about these attacks and on these Muslim nations. I think we have to remember an attack on a Muslim nation, peacekeeping, might be perceived differently than an attack on a Western. Right. So we have to keep that in mind. They're not going to gain as much legitimacy by attacking a Muslim country. And so that's why when we're thinking about composition of peacekeeping forces between Muslim or even some African nations that have had good relations would make the most sense and take away some of the power of needing to attack a peacekeeping force for political reasons. So I think this is why we've been talking in our working group on a variety of different countries, because again, doesn't mean there will not be an attack. That's not what we're saying. But you take away some of the power of why using that attack. And as we mentioned, Pakistan is not going to be seen neutral. And at this point, given the sensitivity of everything, it cannot be seen as siding with one or the other.
Thank you. And I see Mr. Miesi, I think it's Mr. Miesi, is at the top of the hands raised list. So I'd like to allow him into the conversation now, Saulo, if we could, to ask his question. Then I can find out
Should be
how
moving
badly.
on now. There's a slight delay in moving
Okay.
the panelist.
Yep, I understand. And when you come into the conversation for a moment with your hand raised up, if you would just introduce yourself, let us know who you are, how to correctly pronounce your name, with whom you're affiliated, etc. That would be just terrific.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm Harun Mandena Miesi from Kenya, one of the co-founder of Global Peace Champion. So my question is, Taliban was listed as one of the terror group in since 2001. So the question is the resurgence of Taliban influence other terror groups to take influence in power? Like, we feel a lot of pressure for some of the terror group in Somalia. So what does this mean to other terror group? Because leaving of USA from Taliban, it means a lot to some of these terror groups. So we'd like to get more views from expert perspective. Thank you.
I'm happy to take this one. So while it was listed, it was never listed by the United States as part of the foreign terrorist organizations for a purpose, because they recognized and realized that they probably needed to talk to them, and we've been talking to them. I would say another thing is this idea that we've never talked to terrorists as countries has been, it's something that keeps being brought up, but we all know from history it's a myth. We want to think about the United Kingdom, the policy he was saying while talking to the IRA, right? We can go through this country by country, including the United States, right, as well over the years. Now that's a separate, so I don't think it's just the label, but I do agree with you. Their victory does represent something. And we're hearing chatter among other groups in other places. And that's why more than ever, we need to have this discussion right now. And as Professor Chang said, the counterfactual of what if we don't do anything. And that's what I worry about. And so this is why it's right now a moment to try to better get a grasp of the situation and try to encourage them to have some form of bringing them in. They've been willing to talk, and they've been willing to join as early as 2004, but we've always said no. So then the question is, would they have gotten to this level if we had said yes at any other point?
Let me just quickly add, one of the only kind of parts of the negotiations that the Taliban had to agree to was actually not harboring any terrorist groups in Afghanistan in the future. And so that is a starting point for some kind of ability to be able to monitor what is going on, because as Fatin said, other groups are maybe getting inspired by the victory. And so whether or not the Taliban become allies to these other groups is a question mark. And that's kind of, having a monitoring mission would be very helpful in terms of trying to make sure that doesn't happen.
Lisa?
Can I just add, so I took this question also to be just generally sort of how the victory of the Taliban sort of inspires others. And I think we see this sort of inspiration and learning across groups. So, and I think that's a really strong argument for why the UN needs to get involved now. And several of the questions are about like who should get involved. I think the West definitely needs to step back. We have been there now for 20 years and accomplished absolutely nothing but civilian suffering. So it's time to step back, but sort of make room for others to come in. But the UN needs to take lead here and sort of make sure that the Taliban doesn't sort of sit on this victory and sort of is able to just implement its own plan for Afghanistan without any sort of international involvement, I think. So.
Thank you. Let's go to another question in the chat. And I'm going to encourage Professor Chang to answer this one directly. That's directed just to her. But to tie together what we were just talking about with the question in the chat, I think I'm going to jump to the next one, which is someone asks, how does the panel feel time plays into a peacekeeping response? While immediate response would be best to set the conditions as early as possible, it's a highly charged environment with increased risks for escalation. And this is a really, really good question. One thing to know is that our group mobilized as quickly as it did with the understanding that the fastest a UN can mobilize a peacekeeping mission, if they decided to do so today, would be 60 days. That's basically the shortest, fastest rapid deployment brigade that they have. So a lot is going to change in Afghanistan in the next 60 days. A lot may change in the next 2 weeks. So we are really looking over the horizon from what's happening now to what might be happening next. And at the same time, you might say, if we could put a mission in right now, it wouldn't be the right time. And when would be? So this is a really great question. How quickly should we be moving to plan, and what would the ideal conditions be for actually initiating such a mission? How would you peacekeeping experts answer that question, who know a lot about how many different missions look and have worked and succeeded or been less successful around the globe? Lisa.
If I can start, I'm struggling with this question because it's so hard and challenging. I think my initial thought was like, we need to get moving quick, but that doesn't mean we need to sort of get people on the ground and directly. I think there's, especially now with the takeover, and a lot of us don't really know sort of what's going on. Does anyone really know sort of how strong the Taliban are? Sort of how much they're actually able to control, sort of, their own forces and various territories in the country. So I think a really good analysis of the situation must be done before a mission is deployed. But I think the political process needs to start now. So moving fast with the political process, negotiating the terms, etc., must come now. But then the actual implementation must, be done in a sort of slow pace that allows for analysis and getting experts involved and sort of getting all relevant actors involved.
Terrific, thank you. We've got another hand up. Saulo, if we could allow Aurora Akanksha to be heard and seen on video, if possible, to ask her question of the panel, that would be terrific. And Aurora, when you come into the panel on video, if you would let us know who you are and what your question is, that would be terrific.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for organizing this panel. Thanks, Charlie, and all the professors here. I created a website with a group of other activists called deploypeace.org that is about encouraging a peacekeeping mission. There's something that John said earlier during the session and I think I kind of heard it over the past hour, that you all agree we need something because we cannot go with things as they are and expect Taliban to do the right thing. So my question is, what are you doing for advocacy efforts beyond organizing sessions? Like, you are very powerful in your own positions. I agree we haven't fully nailed down the details of what the peacekeeping mission should be, but this whole discussion of political negotiation among members, what are you contributing towards it? Because as activists, I feel all we can do is tweet, write to our senators and do all that stuff. You are in such influential position, and are you going to use that as an academic exercise? Or are you actually going to be able to make a difference? Because, politically, it's not a voting issue. In any Western country, UN issues are not voting issues, like Myanmar, like what happened and all this stuff. So you are the only guardians here to make this happen. And I urge all of you to step beyond your comfort zone of academia and actually go into academic activism or encourage your students to do more. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Akanksha. That's a terrific point. I'll let the panel speak to it first, and then I'll have an answer as well before we move on. Dr. Chang, it looked like you had some thoughts on this.
Yeah. So there's always a fine line between trying to appear that we're objective in our judgments and also becoming, outright activists. And I think, I'm somebody that has actually stepped onto the activist side quite deliberately, but I think it depends on the kind of academic you want to be. That's just a point in terms of thinking about it from the academic's point of view. And then the other thing, Aurora, to say is that I think you overestimate our power. I mean, I would love to have the kind of influence that you're ascribing to us as a group. I think what we do have is maybe some moral authority, and I think we have independence, which I think is really valuable, really, really valuable. And in an environment where everybody has some kind of stake in the game and very clear dog in the fight, I think as academics, we have more credibility when we say, okay, we think this is good for these people for these reasons, because we are seen as not having a direct stake in the outcome in quite the same way. So I think that gives us a tremendous amount of ability to speak and to say things that, and I've often served this function in policy meetings, right? That people want me to be the person who raises up the controversial points that they are thinking, but they don't want to say because it'll upset the minister. And I think that's the kind of role that think tankers and academics, but especially academics, especially academics with tenure, think tankers are still reliant on funding. NGOs are still reliant on funding. We are not reliant on funding in anywhere near the same way. So we have this sense of, we can really say it like it is. And I think we can't pull any punches when we are invited into those rooms. And I would not be surprised if people who are attending either as panelists or also as participants in the seminar, some of us will be in some of those discussions in the next coming months to say, what do you think about this possibility? And at that point, I would just really deeply encourage you to speak up and say it like you see it, and don't care about what's at stake for you, and don't be afraid of looking stupid or asking or saying something that you think is really obvious. Call it like you see it, because I think so much of the time we're in those rooms and we don't fully take advantage of that power, or that you were alluding to. The power is to speak out when other people are afraid to.
And Aurora, I loved your question. It reminds me of a line my old dissertation advisor always used to say to me when he was socializing me into the profession of political science, because I had the heart of an activist. Of course, that's why I went into studying human rights activism and human security issues. I want to make the world better, and many of us came to the profession for that reason. But his quote, and I use it for my students as well, was the difference between a science and an activist is that a scientist's mind can conceivably be changed by the evidence. So that's not necessarily, the best activists also would change their minds based on the evidence. But I think that there's a role for social scientists who study these kinds of issues and the effectiveness of these sorts of policies in really bringing to bear in the conversation, what's the evidence base? What do we know about what's effective and under what conditions? And I think that is a very important role that is distinctive from taking a position on what we should do, but is crucial in determining the very best decisions about what we should and shouldn't do. And it's often very crucial in putting ideas on the policy menu that maybe were forgotten or dismissed, or lay people who aren't looking at the data that Professor Hultman has at the Conflict Center at Uppsala on all of these peacekeeping missions. In the mind of the average citizen or the average policymaker, even maybe they're just thinking how it's been so bad in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Peacekeeping is dangerous and fraught and it doesn't work. But actually the data shows that that's an outlier. And under most conditions, it's very effective. And even under those conditions, it's doing more harm than good, or more good than harm. So these are things scientists can speak to. And our working group has been focused on really trying to analyze, taking seriously this question of peacekeeping, but really trying to analyze the what and the how in a very even-handed way, but in a way that can speak to policymakers who were skeptical and potentially connect with individuals closer to the UN, individuals closer to the State Department, individuals in the Indo-Pacific theater, in military academies over there, or at the Kofi Annan Peacekeeping Center in Ghana, a country known for contributing troops to missions such as these. So there's a powerful network of people we're connected to that we can put some thoughts on their agenda and potentially have an impact, as you hope we might. Now, that's not the same as doing advocacy, and that's where you come in. If you take what you're hearing today and find it convincing, by all means, go out and mobilize people to put pressure on policymakers. That's not exactly our role, but that's definitely a way in which we can work together in the service of this agenda, if that makes sense to you. But our job is also to help policymakers think through what's all the tools in their tool belt and which ones are going to be the best at saving the most lives in this context. Human Security Lab will be convening some conversations between academics and stakeholders in the coming days, and I imagine there will be more of those at other universities who are in our network. So we're very happy to continue reporting back on those as this conversation develops, and I'd be very, very interested in staying in touch with your movement. I'd be happy to do interviews with you so your constituents can understand more about peacekeeping, how it works. And I think many of those in this working group might also be interested in doing that. So thank you so much for coming and for that really rich question. Let's see what else is in the chat. We've got about another 15 minutes before we should close. Someone asks, what about a civilian observer mission from OSCE? The Taliban would be more likely to accept that over an armed UN peacekeeping presence. OSCE already has a solid presence in Central Asia and could have an easier buy-in from Russia, ? What do you guys think? This is a great question. It's true that the mission in Ukraine has been, as I understand it, quite successful. What do you think? What are the advantages and disadvantages or differences between a mission, peacekeeping mission that is, or a peace observer mission that is not under UN umbrella versus one that is? I think there was a similar question down the list about other regional kinds of organizations that can do similar work. Lisa.
I hope someone else also wants to answer this. Because I'm struggling again. I think the UN has to be involved, but I could see the potential for like a joint mission of some sort. But maybe a regional mission is not off the table completely, but I would rather see the UN be involved. And I think it's both because the UN has much more sort of bargaining leverage and comes with sort of a big organization that could bring in other resources, humanitarian aid, etc., that are needed. But also, I think the end product, and it speaks to other questions about who should take the lead. I think it's important that there's not one main contributor to this mission. It has to be like spread out across a lot of actors so that it's not a Chinese mission. It cannot be a Russian mission. It has to be a really sort of a multinational one, although with very limited presence from the West. That would be the only caveat.
Other thoughts on this? Chiara.
I mean, I agree with Lisa that I think it should be the UN. I think that the OSCE wouldn't come with the same kind of, signaling effect that it is the United Nations that are really keen on a peaceful, potentially peaceful resolution eventually of the conflict. And I think so in this respect, also the UN allows us to think a little bit more creatively about a wider range of options. So particularly given that the time right now is so limited and we need to think a little bit creatively, and also the kinds of options we have are so few that we really need to think creatively about, how can we think of a military observer mission, for instance, that, as can really project a, strong signaling and commitment, sort of a commitment from the United Nations, but also with some tools that have been used in maybe perhaps more robust missions that we can think of. So I think the UN just allows us to think about a wider range of options, and it allows us to really maximize the diversity. And also it allows us to try at least to distance a potential UN mission from the Western, sort of kinds of peace operations. So I think given these 3 points, I think a UN mission is more suitable than a OSCE or other kind of regional missions.
just real quick, I'll also just add that it's not clear what regional mission would make sense here either necessarily, because there's no regional security organization in South Asia or Central Asia for that matter. So, with conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a very clear go-to regional organization, which is the African Union. And so that's, there isn't a clear answer necessarily of who would take responsibility and why, whereas it makes sense for the UN, who already has a presence, through UNAMA anyway, to take the lead.
Thank you. We have time for one more spoken question asker. It looks like Brian E.W. is in the list with the raised hand. I'm going to allow you to talk, Brian, and give us your question. Maybe tell us a little bit about who you are as well. Or did they?
Hello, everyone. So I think, can you hear me now? Yes. Thank you so much. It's been a really, really, really interesting conversation. I just had one question on what international laws are we aware of that can help to support a sustainable peace in the future, even in places like Afghanistan?
Thank you. And Brian, can you tell us who you are? Are you a student? Are you an analyst?
Yes.
Are you an activist?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. My name's Bryony, and I'm from IWPG, the International Women's Peace Group.
Terrific. Good to have you here. And a great question for the panelists. Who wants to take it away?
I'll start. I really sometimes think that as such a somebody from the Middle East region, that it's such a Western perspective of wanting international law to be at the heart of a lot of these things. And I get that as someone who's been living 21 years now in the West. But I really think that, as Dr. Chang said, when we think about any of these things, we need to be thinking about the Afghani. That is the person in mind that is in a rural area that has been suffering for the last 20 years without food, without water, climate change issues, disasters. 44% depend on agriculture. About 50 some now have been under poverty for quite some time. So I think that is where I would say there's lots of rules and laws that may be applicable to help maybe Western states in order to get their public to be okay with what they're doing. But I feel like the international law right now, perception from the citizens of the Middle East and of the Near East region and Muslim majority countries is that it is a tool that is used when the West likes it. And then it is, people turn a blind eye. So for me, I think it might be important again for Western nations, but I think less so from the regional perspective or aspect.
Let me just add real quick. Sorry, Christine.
Okay.
So I put a book in the chat, and also to answer your question, Bernie, about so the two authors here argue about the importance of international law and being able to prevent conflict and how that's kind of contributed to a norm. I will say, however, that I think Fatin is completely right that we've actually seen a decline in the legitimacy of international laws, particularly the International Criminal Court, where a number of countries that were members of the ICC have withdrawn just because they see it as a tool of the West to be able to prosecute people from African countries and other countries that are non-West. And so international law is tricky because it is a Western concept, and so being able to apply that in a place that may not see it as legitimate is maybe not the right tool necessarily.
Christine, go ahead.
I'm going to double down on what both of you have just said and completely agree with all of that. And just really thinking about, I think it's very, if you're not spending time there, you think that the laws actually work. You think that the police works. You think that everything works. The state doesn't work. It doesn't work the way that we think it works. It certainly doesn't work the way that it works in, where we are in the UK or in the US or in Canada or wherever, right? So we have to throw all of those assumptions away about the fact that institutions work, because they don't. And in fact, they're more often seen as a hindrance and corrupt and deeply problematic, and a large part of why the Taliban is celebrated and appreciated in parts of the rural areas, because they are actually seen as the ones who are much more consistent in how they enforce judgments. And I think that's just something else that, you know, we shouldn't, I think we have this lofty idea of how it works in theory, but then how it works in practice, huge disjunctures. But that made me think about a new point that I really hadn't appreciated really until this conversation, and which is why one more reason why we should have a mission there is that if there is no Western presence of any kind, or even influence over a presence, there's probably going to be some kind of transitional justice proceeding, I would imagine, right? And it will look like a complete condemnation of the torture that Western troops have undertaken and allowed, and all the rest. And you can imagine what that's going to look like. And there will not be, you know, the converse kind of conversation around what, you know, other groups like the Taliban have done. It will look like a very different kind of transitional justice than I think what we would be used to, but it will be on parade for the rest of the world. And you will, you know, again, speaking purely not from the Afghan interest, or maybe from the Afghan interest, but if you are thinking strategically about the long-term interests of the United States, your dirty laundry is going to be on show for everybody in great detail. That's absolutely what I would do if I was in charge of the country. And being, I mean, unless there was something that was holding me back from doing that, like aid or international recognition or whatever, right? But, you know, if we're talking about transitional justice, here's a moment for it, and we're not going to like the look of it.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much for that question, Briony. Good to have you here. We have time, I think, for one more question from the chat, and then we're going to close, although I could stick around for a few more minutes if there was a desire for more conversation. Let's see. Also, I see Professor Faten at the very bottom of the Q&A. There's a question directed to you, and perhaps you can scroll down and just answer that one directly. But at the top of the list, and I think this is a good question to end on, because it's about, you know, possible side effects of a mission, regardless of how effective, regardless of how warranted. UN peacekeeping missions have often had some harmful side effects as well, and there's a good question about how to make sure as we go forward, any mission that is organized, whether in Afghanistan or somewhere else, is least susceptible to that. So this person asks, if a UN peacekeeping mission is deployed, how do we keep it from becoming exploitative? Could it become a means for other countries to exploit the land? Is diversity of peacekeepers enough? There was previously a question in this list as well about sexual exploitation by peacekeepers, which has been a concern in recent years and in some missions specifically. So I think that's a terrific one for the panel to address, and the peacekeeping experts on this panel. What is the UN doing in recent years to address those kinds of concerns? Is it getting better at that? And how would you minimize those externalities if there were a peacekeeping mission in this region?
I'll just start. I think when we think of peacekeeping missions, we tend to think of them in a kind of a homogenous unit. That it's, you know, that because certain units in certain countries or certain individuals are, you know, perpetrating SCA or drunk driving or, you know, other things that constitute a negative externality, that it's the entire mission that is unsuccessful, when that's not the case. I think what needs to happen is that we need to be very intentional in who is chosen to go on peacekeeping missions, to make sure that it's not about quantity necessarily, but rather about the best quality and the best people in terms of skill sets that are needed for this particular mission. So really designing having a firm understanding of the dynamics on the ground and matching that with people that have skills to handle that kind of situation is really important, instead of just taking the blueprint from Mali or taking the blueprint from the DRC and applying it in this case. I think what would be really helpful is for the UN to move towards a kind of a very tailored model for each condition, and that's going to reduce a number of the negative externalities.
I just want to add something a little bit different from my area of study, is that in a lot of these Muslim countries, thinking of Lebanon, thinking of Turkey, for example, there are now women in the military that wear the hijab. right? So this is something that is pretty new, and it's been in the last several years where this authorization has been happening, where before the women that joined did not wear it. And so there are ways now to start thinking about the training that these women, and the women, for example, I know Lebanon well, my home country, they've been getting the same training as the men. And part of the reason why we have those is because of the rise of groups like ISIS and Nusra in Lebanon. And they needed women to be there because they would use women to smuggle or dress as women to smuggle themselves out. And so they needed women with some of these units when they go in for getting somebody, or if they have a tip. So I think there are ways now emerging where women in Muslim majority countries can help if they're going to be part of a mission in a way that maybe previously when we were thinking about women, not so much. So I think that's a window of opportunity, but I'm not the peacekeeping expert, they all are. And so that goes back to them.
Maybe can I just add on sort of the ways of avoiding sort of certain countries to take sort of exploit the mission for their own sort of interests. I think the diversity of the mission is one sort of, again, a key point here, but also a narrow mandate, sort of very limited task. There has to be sort of a clear end goal, and we're not stationing these people to stay forever, but it has to be a clear end goal that is not, completely sort of a complete fantasy, but a very sort of limited one that can be done, and then that doesn't allow sort of certain countries to come in and take over or exploit the situation, or reduces the risk at least.
And just to add to this conversation, I think we also need to, among all UN troop contributing countries, we need to work harder, as Sabrina said, to better tailor what is needed for the mission with the kind of troop that we need, both in terms of specialty, in terms of perhaps military culture and kinds of training, but also work harder to make sure that across these different approaches and ways of doing things, there are socialization processes ongoing where we are aware of differences, where we can minimize the negative effects and adverse effects of diversity, but where there is also more control across to really minimize the kinds of exploitation and abuses that we have seen in other missions. So I think they're working harder on both fronts, but really work towards eventually perhaps a UN army, and also maximize and tailoring better what is needed to what we have is what we really need to work towards, I think.
Great answers to that very difficult question. I want to just offer some closing thoughts before we wrap up the formalities here, which is to thank the panel again and the audience for asking such interesting and astute questions. I mean, certainly, if this policy idea is taken up by those who have the power to make it happen, which is not us, it is UN officials, it is diplomats, these are among the questions that they need to analyze and sort out and balance. And as scientists, we can help, but we're really just advisors, if that. But again, we shouldn't assume that because there could be negative side effects, that this is not a reason to consider, that this is a reason not to consider the idea, right? It's what it is a reason to plan to mitigate those side effects. And the research that we have on what those side effects are and how to mitigate them, again, can be very, very helpful in constructing the nuts and bolts of that mission. I think it's important not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. The fact that it could be difficult to do this, and it would be difficult in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a difficult political environment. The fact that the political will would need to be built and isn't readily available, that is also true right now. These aren't reasons not to think this through. These are reasons to get cracking and think it through sooner rather than later. I think there's a tendency also among skeptics that I've spoken with, and I've heard from a lot of them since I first wrote an article of my own a few weeks ago about the potential for a peacekeeping mission. What I hear from skeptics is often that they're comparing the worst case scenario with peacekeepers to the best case scenario without them. And I think we have to sort of think in equal comparisons here. A world in which a peacekeeping mission that faces obstacles or is less than 100% effective, that could still be a far less scary world than one in which the international community looks the other way from a country that needs help and deserves help, out of fear that a mission will be difficult or that a few lives will be lost. So that's sort of how I come to this conversation. I come to this conversation as a scientist. I founded Human Security Lab precisely for moments like this, where there's a policy gap, some tools out there that aren't getting adequate consideration in the policy community, and to have the ability to convene really smart scientists who I know and can pull together through my networks to just think and brainstorm and put some ideas out there. That's what we can contribute. And I'm so thankful to this group for coming together so rapidly, along with many, many others from around the world over the last days and weeks, to put together some of these ideas. Someone in the chat said, when is your document coming out, lining out this peacekeeping mission? Well, that's not entirely for us to do, but we will have some thoughts on paper for you in the next days. And there's much, much more to be said and thought through and discussed. And I'm excited that so many of you are now participating in these conversations. So thanks so much for coming today.